never used to question history.
You cannot say this isn't a mystery.
Ancient architecture, old buildings.
This was machined, but who machined it?
The origins of humanity, a settled matter in dusty textbooks. But then,
Puma Punku, what a mind fuck that place is.
every stone, every carving leaves more questions than answers.
What is the biggest block?
125 tons.
How?
No one can solve the mystery.
Why?
This just can't be done with stone hammers.
Who?
If anything looks like ancient aliens, it's this stone.
They could be hundreds of thousands of years old. We don't know. This
is the story of Puma Punku. Let's go down the rabbit hole. South America, 1549. While searching for the capital of the Inca Empire, Spanish conquistador Pedro Cieza de Leon crossed into Bolivia and discovered the ancient ruins of a place called Tiwanaku, an abandoned city of enormous stones that were so large he almost couldn't even comprehend what he was looking at. Here's what he wrote in his journals. In Tiwanaku stand stone statues so imposing that one wonders how the human hand could carry them to where they are today. Some of these stones are consumed and in ruins, other stones form doorways, all made from a single block. We do not comprehend with which tools such work could have been achieved, and no one understands how these giant weights could have ever been moved. Now, as legend has it, Pedro met with the Inca elders from the local tribe, asking a bunch of questions about these stones and how they were created, and what they told him would change his world forever. I asked the natives whether these buildings had been erected during the age of the Incas. They laughed and answered, the buildings had been there for many years before the Incas began their rule. These structures, they assured me, and they knew this with certainty from their forefathers, had been built in a single night, constructed by beings whose origin they did not know. Now, Pedro didn't know it at the time, but his journals would become the first ever written record of the ruins at Tiwanaku, because no written record from whoever built these stones have ever been found. And when Pedro found out that these uniquely shaped, sharp-edged megaliths were in ruins by the time the Inca, the oldest known tribe in the area, found them, well, that started a mystery that's still largely unsolved to this day. Here's what I mean. The ruins at Tiwanaku have multiple areas, each equally as mysterious in its own ways, from an astronomically aligned temple to a wall that has eerily alien stone heads embedded directly into it. But let's start with the most compelling of them all, an area known as Puma Punku. Puma Punku sits in a desert plateau at an altitude of almost 13,000 feet, where you'll find stone blocks carved into unique geometric shapes with laser-like precision and surfaces polished as smooth as glass. Weighing over 100 tons, the stones found at this site are among the largest on the entire planet. Just for comparison, the largest stone found in the Great Pyramid was only 80 tons. And adding to the overall eeriness of the site, the Puma Punku stones look nothing like any of the other stones found in Tiwanaku because none of them have any carvings or hieroglyphs of any kind. Just smooth, perfectly flat surfaces cut at perfect 90-degree angles and forming complex shapes that almost look machined. And what's interesting is that the construction style used at Puma Punku relied heavily on having very precise cuts because no mortar or concrete of any kind was used to join them together. And in the parts that are still intact today, you can see that the joints between the stones are so tightly fit that you can't even fit a piece of paper between them. Across the site, you'll also find large platform stones that are all made out of a single block. Carved to such a precision, the surface is so flat, it's perfectly level to within 1 degree.
That takes some level of sophistication. In order to create a flat surface, that requires some degree of technology. Of course, we have things like levels, but it's doubtful that the Tiwanaku culture had anything like that.
And what makes the puzzle of Puma Punku even harder to solve is that the stones themselves are so randomly scattered across the landscape, almost like Legos thrown onto the ground, potentially suggesting that whatever this site used to be and whatever these stones used to form was either intentionally destroyed or that an ancient cataclysm of some sort came in and completely decimated whatever structure these giant Lego-like blocks used to form. Now, according to the mainstream, Puma Punku was built in 536 AD by an unknown Tiwanaku civilization. And it's unknown because whoever it was mysteriously disappeared hundreds, if not thousands of years before the Inca arrived. And because of the complete lack of any written record, for all we know, the site could be thousands, if not tens of thousands of years old.
So we're talking about a location super ancient and made originally using lost ancient high technology.
In fact, Austrian engineer Arthur Poznansky, who spent most of his life studying the site from 1904 to 1946, he believed believe that the site dated back to 15,000 BC for a number of reasons that we'll cover in a second, but even if we accept the mainstream idea that this was only built in the 500s, this still means that whoever built it would have had to use primitive tools like copper chisels and chicken bones. Here's why that's an issue. There were two main types of stones used at Puma Punku: red sandstone and andesite. Now, red sandstone, which makes up a lot of the large platform stones weighing between 130 and 180 tons, these came from a quarry that was about 6 miles away on a path that required going over at least one mountain range. And the andesite, which makes up a lot of the relatively smaller, more complex stones, were found to come from a quarry that was on top of a volcano 56 miles away and on a path that would require crossing over Lake Titicaca, the largest body of water in South America. Now, the official explanation for how these stones were moved such large distances is that they were pulled into place using ropes and wooden rollers. And the only problem with that explanation, Puma Punku is 13,000 feet above sea level, meaning that it's above the tree line and there are no trees that grow at that altitude. So the idea that they use wooden rollers really starts to fall apart because there are no trees to cut down to make the wooden rollers from. In fact, during the 1960s, the Bolivian army conducted an experiment where they tried to raise one of these 2-ton blocks using nothing more than ropes and manpower, and they were barely able to nudge it a few inches. But again, even if we accept that they moved the largest known monoliths on planet Earth inconceivable distances using wooden rollers that couldn't have existed at that elevation, that still doesn't explain how they cut these stones. You see, andesite is a volcanic rock that's extremely hard and dense. In fact, it's not even possible to cut andesite or red sandstone using copper tools because both of these stones have a hardness of 7 out of 10 on the Mohs hardness scale, while copper is only a 3 out of 10. And if you know anything about the hardness of a rock, you can't cut hard rock with softer rock. As an example, take a look at some of these stones here that seem to have what look like drill holes. Perfectly circular holes going straight through some rocks, and on other rocks, smaller drill holes spaced at perfectly regular intervals and going to the exact same depth. I mean, these stones give me flashbacks to building IKEA furniture. And the idea that they were cut with copper chisels is almost impossible to comprehend, because if we wanted to recreate these stones today, it would most definitely require heavy machinery and diamond-bladed saws or lasers. In fact, in 2012, engineer Chris Dunn did an experiment where he was trying to figure out exactly how these stones could have been cut. And so he took a small piece of andesite from one of the stones found at Puma Punku and made 2 cuts right next to it using modern machinery. One cut was done with a laser and another cut was done with a diamond-bladed saw. And when he did, they found the laser cut left very distinct striations or lines in the stone that looked a little bit different than the original cut surface. But the diamond cut, on the other hand, while not exactly the same, was very reminiscent of the original smooth surface. And if it wasn't for the thousands of years worth of weathering, it might have been an exact match. But perhaps the most unique and compelling of all the stones found in Puma Punku are what's known as the H blocks, named that for their iconic H shape. Each one has over 80 different stone faces and was carved out of a single block of andesite with such eerie precision that there's essentially zero error in the finer details of these perfectly flat surfaces with sharp corners and edges. Now here's where the mystery of these H blocks deepens.
Yep.
What's your thoughts on Puma Punku?
It almost looks to me like precast concrete or some type of mixture of some material that's been cast and then put into place.
Due to their uniform shape, most mainstream archaeologists will tell you that these H blocks were made by pouring some sort of concrete into a mold of some sort. But when taking a closer look, that theory actually starts to fall apart, because in the 1870s, there was a German geologist who essentially measured every surface of these H blocks. And interestingly, when he did, he found not only were the blocks perfectly symmetrical, which would have been hard to accomplish if this was done just by hammers and chisels, but also, although the H blocks had the same shape, none of them were the exact same size. And according to Brian Forrester, an archaeologist who's been studying Puma Punku for the last 2 decades, it should be noted that the H blocks are not exactly the same dimensions, and thus the idea that they were mass-produced and created in a mold must be rejected. The designs on the backs vary in some cases greatly, so it is obvious that each one was individually crafted. The question of how and why are yet to be determined. So what was the purpose of these H blocks? Well, the answer to that question may lie in 2 unique features that they have. The first is that they're magnetic. You see, in recent years, researchers started to notice that whenever they brought their compasses near any of the andesite blocks, the needle of the compass would start to spin, and in some cases doing a complete 360, meaning that somehow these andesite stones were generating their own magnetic field. Now, it's not clear exactly how they became magnetized, or even if it was done intentionally, but it is clear that at one point in time, they were exposed to something that gave them this ability. The only question is, what? Which brings me to the dovetail cuts. You see, one of the unexpected finds of the H blocks was that the groove between the two posts that make up the H was actually not cut at a right angle, but rather a distinct dovetail shape. And if you look at how we use the dovetail cut today, it's a construction technique that's used to hold two things together. The only thing is, the male counterpart to the dovetail cut within these H blocks has never been found. So the true purpose of them is still unknown. Speaking of joining stones together, another construction technique that was really intriguing to find at Puma Punku was the use of keystone cuts. Now, the keystone cut is a little bit different than the dovetail cut because the keystone cut was used to join a lot of the larger platform stones. And the way it works was by melting bronze and pouring it into the cut so that way when the metal hardens, it locks the stones in place. But here's the issue with that. At an altitude of 13,000 feet above sea level, it is very difficult to smelt bronze. And doing so would actually require temperatures much higher than a traditional campfire could accomplish.
Especially if you're a relatively crude culture. So it's possible that the bronze class were made by a much older civilization with the capability of melting bronze with ease.
And here's the craziest part of all. Keystone cuts that are identical to the ones found at Puma Punku have been found at other mysterious megalithic sites across the world, such as the Sun Temple in Korikancha or Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and even the Sphinx Temple in the Giza Plateau. And again, at a time where no civilization was supposed to be that widespread around the planet, and in a Tiwanaku civilization that even the mainstream archaeologists will tell you had no form of written communication. So was Puma Punku built by Bronze Age people with primitive tools, or by ancient aliens thousands of years ago? The answer to that question may lie in a site that's only a quarter of a mile away from Puma Punku that may hold direct evidence of ancient extraterrestrial contact. The year is 1932, and Professor Arthur Poznansky, who'd spent the last 3 decades filling his journal with notes about the ruins at Tiwanaku, found what appeared to be a large statue of some sort that likely hadn't seen the light of day for thousands of years. At about 25 feet long, this block of andesite had to weigh at least 20 tons. And by the time him and a team of archaeologists were able to lift this thing out of the ground, they realized that it had thousands of perfectly preserved, intricate carvings that were covering this stone statue from head to toe. Today, this statue stands at a nearby museum, and the locals refer to the being that's depicted as Pachamama, which translates to the cosmic mother. Could Tiwanaku really have a cosmic connection? As Poznansky would find out, the answer was yes. You see, less than a mile away from Puma Punku is a temple complex that's lined with stone walls, and embedded in the stone walls are hundreds of tiny heads that were carved out of stone, and the faces of which range so much in characteristics that no two of the faces are exactly alike. What's weird is that a few of these faces look distinctly non-human. You could almost say alien. And the thing is, nobody knows exactly what these stones were meant to represent because these walls haven't always been there. They were only built in the 1960s when the Bolivian government thought it'd be a good idea to try to reconstruct this temple using stones that they found in the ground near Puma Punku and the surrounding area. And all of these stone heads were included in what they found. But when Poznansky was around in the early 1900s, the only thing that stood here were these heavily eroded Stonehenge-like pillars, and these pillars can still be seen within the structure of these walls today. Now, Poznansky was enamored by these pillars, and he spent the majority of his career studying these stones and their positions relative to each other because he thought that they might have a rhyme or reason behind why they were placed there, eventually realizing that the stones form what appears to be an ancient cosmic calendar. Here's what he wrote in his book in 1945, the year before he died. It has been proven beyond all doubt that the temple was a true solar observatory and at the same time a magnificent stone calendar. When the observer stands at the center of the west wall, the north and south pillars are so located that the sun would rise at the solstices on the outer corners of these pillars. However, if we examine this phenomenon with precision instruments, we note a difference of approximately 18 minutes, which represents the change in obliquity of the ecliptic between that of the period in which the temple was built and that which it has today. This difference has served as the basis for the calculation of the age of Tiwanaku. So what age for Tiwanaku did Poznansky come up with? When accounting for the difference of the 18 minutes, which was caused by the change in Earth's tilt over time, time, his measurements estimated that for the pillars to have been placed to perfectly mark the solstices, you'd have to go back to 15,000 BC. And aside from the fact that this date would rewrite history if true, what makes it even trippier is the fact that when he was studying the carvings on the Pachamama monolith, he realized that the right and left half were perfectly symmetrical, an exact mirror image of each other. And eventually, after going over every minute detail, taking every line and circle and symbol into account, he concluded the engravings ironically also represented a calendar. And if his calendar theory was correct, by his calculations, it would also date back to 15,000 BC. And the crazy thing is that date specifically lines up with the controversial dating of other megalithic sites around the world that are still being debated to this day. From the recent discovery of Göbekli Tepe buried in a hillside in Turkey, to the proposed destruction of Atlantis written about by Aristotle, and even to the controversial water erosion found on the Sphinx. Which brings us to the question, could Tiwanaku really be that old? And if so, is there any evidence for this? Well, as ancient astronaut theorists believe, the answer is unequivocally yes. You see, one defining feature that's found on a lot of the ruins of Tiwanaku and Puma Punku is the fact that a lot of them have what looks distinctly like water erosion, such as these stones at Puma Punku, and these stone pillars, and these steps at the temple complex. So does the water erosion hypothesis hold any weight? Well, even though Tiwanaku is at 13,000 feet above sea level, it's actually really close to Lake Titicaca. Today, the shore of the lake is about 7 miles away from Puma Punku, but if we went back in time about 12,000 years ago, the surface of the lake would have been about 100 feet higher than it is today. And considering the position of these water eroded steps at Puma Punku, a 110-foot rise in the lake's level would bring the shoreline almost exactly to the bottom step. But one eerie factor that could in itself prove that Puma Punku was around 12,000 years ago is the scattered nature of the stones. If the site does go back to 15,000 BC, then that date also lines up with something called the Younger Dryas impact, when a large asteroid hit Earth and ended the ice age almost instantly about 11,500 years ago. And it's this asteroid impact that is theorized to be the event that caused the same Great Flood that most religious texts talk about. So if Puma Punku really was around back during that time, a large impact or even a major flood would definitely have enough power to not only wipe out whatever civilization built these stones, but also to leave them scattered in ruins like they are today. Which brings me to one of the most iconic stones found in Tiwanaku, a stone called the Sungate. The Sungate is a 10-ton, 10-foot tall, doorway-shaped stone carved from a single piece of andesite. Today, it sits in the same temple complex that I just told you about, but that's not where it was originally found, because when it was found, it was face down, partially buried, and broken in half. And many people think that whatever event scattered the stones also had enough power to knock over the Sungate, but luckily it did, because it left the face of the stone almost perfectly preserved, compared to the back, which shows very heavy erosion. Now the face, like the Pachamama monolith, has intricate carvings that are etched directly into the hard andesite, which depict 48 winged beings surrounding a central main figure wearing a mask that's said to represent the Andean god Viracocha, who the locals believe created humans. Now most archaeologists look at the Viracocha carving on the Sungate and take that as evidence that Tiwanaku was erected by the Tiwanaku civilization as a sacred place to worship their gods. But German archaeologist Edmund Kiss, who spent 9 years studying the Sungate in the 1930s, thought that maybe there was a deeper meaning behind these carvings. So he examined every tiny circle, every puma head, every snake tail, leaving no detail unaccounted for, and much to his surprise, realized that it too was an elaborate calendar. A calendar that by his calculations dates back 27,000 years. Now, this number was so unbelievable that Kiss himself didn't believe the number and actually tried to get all of his scientist friends to recount what he was saying. Not one of his friends could debunk his research, as they were all coming up with the exact same figures. The only unique thing about his calendar was that they only worked out if the 12 months of the year had 24 days and each day was made up of 30 hours and every hour was made up of 22 minutes. But one thing about those figures, the Mayan calendar, which famously predicted the end of the world to be in 2012 and everybody was freaking out about it, happens to operate on the exact same figures. Now hold on to your tinfoil hats, because this is where the story gets crazy. Today, Tiwanaku is inhabited by the Aymara people, who have been in Tiwanaku for about 800 years and have traces descending from other cultures in the area going back at least 5,000 years. And according to their traditions, Puma Punku was built by the god Viracocha, who came out of the nearby Lake Titicaca with his army army of giants and built Puma Punku and Tiwanaku in one single night. Eventually, Viracocha left Tiwanaku by disappearing over the water as if it were land without sinking and never to return. But it's believed by the locals that he watches over them every day, and they even refer to him as the Watcher. And here's why the term Watcher almost gives me goosebumps. The Watchers are directly referenced in the book of Enoch, which is an ancient Hebrew text where they were mentioned as being a group of angels that came to earth and lived among the people, and then eventually they mated with human women, creating a hybrid race of giants known as the Nephilim. Now, the fact that these Watchers mated with human women angered God so much that he sent a giant flood to cleanse the earth. The same flood that you might have heard of if you've ever heard of the story of Noah's Ark. Could this eerie coincidence be a direct connection between Tiwanaku and the fallen angels from the book of Enoch? And could the same flood that Noah built an ark to escape be the same flood that destroyed Puma Punku thousands of years ago? Well, only time will tell, as it seems that Puma Punku and the mystery around it still has a lot yet to be uncovered due to how many stones are still buried underground. And unfortunately, the Bolivian government seems to have a chokehold on exactly what excavations can and can't be done by archaeologists. Brian Forrester, who I mentioned earlier, is an independent archaeologist who's written 2 books on Tiwanaku, and he's shown that not only is the Bolivian government not in a rush to excavate the entire site, in many cases, some of the places where they've been doing excavations a year or 2 later were actually reburied even more than they were originally.
Curiously, when we came back 2 years later, rather than excavating, the archaeologists filled the area in, not uncovering the past, but hiding the past.
And honestly, I'm not even surprised, because this just seems to be common practice for a lot of the world's governments anytime that things are found by archaeologists that could potentially rewrite history. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example. In the 1990s, German engineer Rudolf Gattenbrink was studying an unexplored shaft of the Queen's Chamber, and using a robot equipped with a camera, in that shaft he found an undiscovered door that had 2 copper handles embedded into it. A crazy discovery, because metal has never been found anywhere else inside the Great Pyramid. Obviously wanting to know what was behind that door, he asked the Egyptian government for permission to look behind it and see. And not only did they deny him permission, but they also banned Rudolf and his team of engineers from ever studying the Great Pyramid ever again. And I tell the entire story of what happened in this video right here. Go check it out.